Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to be kicking off the very first webinar of this series. We are calling it Leading the Way and Solutions for 2024 and Beyond. So thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to hear from the experts that we have together today, and I know you are as well. So let's jump in. Today, we are going to be discussing the correlation between the economy and immigration, a very important topic and one that we really need to make sure is leading the conversation, and we don't get to hear enough about it these days. And so I'm going to start with a few data points to set off the tone for the panelists. First of all, according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, in a report this year, immigration will help to add 7 trillion to the US economy over the next decade. That is a trillion with a T. In February, the Department of Health and Human Services reported that between 2005 and 2019, refugees and asylees alone, not all immigrants in total, but refugees and asylees alone, paid an estimated $363 billion to the federal government through payroll, income, and excess tax, as well as $218 billion to state and local governments through income, sales, and property taxes. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics are now telling us that immigrants make up 20% of our labor force. This is actually an increase, yet the immigrants in our population still come in around 13 to 14% of the total population. And I probably don't have to tell you that we overdepend on immigrants in our labor force in sectors such as construction, hospitality, retail, and healthcare, although many of them serve in key roles beyond those sectors. So as we know, this is definitely a topic that affects us all. And it's a hot topic in our national rhetoric right now, our national discourse. And we don't always get to hear these really clear-eyed and important voices that talk about the intersection of immigration and the economy. But fortunately, we are joined by these incredible experts today that can tell us more about this topic. And I'm really excited to pass the mic now to our forum senior fellow, Linda Chavez. Thank you for moderating us today, Linda.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's really a privilege to be on with such an august panel. Let me just briefly introduce them to you. I could spend a good half hour going over the resumes of these 3 individuals, but I won't. I'm just going to mention a few things about each just to sort of put in perspective where they're coming from and where they've been. First, Stuart Anderson, who is Executive Director of the National Foundation for American Policy. Stuart has been involved in immigration issues for decades. He's also a senior contributor to Forbes magazine, and he's had several jobs on Capitol Hill, including on the Senate Immigration Subcommittee. We also have with us today Pia Orrenius, who is the Vice President and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Her research focuses mostly on labor market impacts of immigration. She is also a senior economist, or was a senior economist on the Economic Advisors Council for President Bush. And she is co-author of the book, Besides the Golden Door, Immigration Reform in an Era of Globalization. And finally, we have Stephanie Martz. She is the Chief Administrative Officer and General Counsel at the National Retail Federation. She has also been a special assistant to the president in the Office of the White House Counsel, and that was when President Obama was in office. And she has served on Capitol Hill as well as the chief counsel to Chuck Schumer, who is, of course, now the leader in the United States Senate. I will just say a word about myself, and that is that I am a senior fellow at the National Immigration Forum, have worked on Capitol Hill during the 1970s on the Judiciary Committee, and spent years in and out of government, including in the Reagan administration and in various roles under President George Herbert Walker Bush. So with no further ado, I'm going to get right into questions. I think Jenny stated it well. You know, when we talk about immigration these days, we always talk about it as if it is a problem. rather than as a positive in what immigration does for our economy. And I want to focus right here at the beginning on a question we don't often hear talked about, and that is we do have a labor shortage in the United States, a very significant one. And I'm going to throw this question to Stuart. How does that labor shortage affect all of us, not just as an employers and employees, but as consumers?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you again to the forum for inviting me. I think the most important thing to think about immigration is to get out of the mind frame of only looking at immigration as a labor issue where we only look at the impact on workers. And by the way, the research really does show, if you look at the latest research from Giovanni Perry and others, that immigrants actually have a positive effect on US workers overall. But we really need to look at immigrants as for their impact on consumers, because most Americans, in fact, every American, uh, is a consumer in some form. Even children are consumers for the products they might use. And if you look across the board at immigrants, they make a significant difference not only on tempering down inflation by increasing the productive capacity of the country, and that's something the Federal Reserve Chairman has talked about several times. But if you look at other areas, nursing homes, for example, if there's been research by Kristen Butcher and others that show that an American who's 65 or over 80 is far less likely to have to go into a nursing home and could get care staying independent at home if there are more immigrants in their area. Foreign physicians, extremely important. They have been shown to increase the life expectancy of people in the states where they've increased the number of foreign physicians through the Conrad 30 program. Construction is something that's really obvious. That's been already mentioned. But when you look at things like restaurants, economist Zeke Hernandez has talked about you have a situation where a restaurant may go into an area because there are a lot of immigrants. And then the US-born people will also frequent the restaurant as consumers, but then US people will also work there as well, and you'll see increased investment connected all because of that. So I think we need to take a much broader perspective than we have in the past on immigration.
I do want to talk specifically about the effect of immigrants in the labor force. Immigrants are just under 14% of the population in the US, and yet this last year they represented, I believe, 19% of the workforce, and that is actually up over the last 2 years, 1% each year. Can you describe, Stuart, why that is? Why are immigrants essentially overrepresented in the workforce?
Well, I think the main reason why immigrants are overrepresented in the workforce, as you correctly point out, has largely to do with the aging U.S. labor force and also the retirement of the baby boomers. I mean, let's face it, when someone is in their 70s or 80s, they're much more likely to be playing golf or playing with their grandchildren than they are to go up on a roof or go up on a construction girder. And that's essentially what we're seeing. Um, and what we found during the Trump administration and then exacerbated by COVID, a large slowdown in the foreign-born working age population. And Madeline Zavodny, economist, did research for us that showed that real GDP growth was lower in 2022 because of that slowdown. In fact, it was about 1.9% was the actual real GDP growth, which is economic growth. And it really could have been up to 3.2%. And as Pia has written about quite a bit, that economic growth is essentially made up of productivity growth and labor force growth. So if you don't have labor force growth, and immigrants are pretty much in some years the only source of labor force growth, or the vast majority of it, then it's going to be very hard to generate economic growth in an economy.
Let me follow up with a question that I think addresses what I call the elephant in the room. Whenever you talk about immigration, if you don't talk about what's happening at the southern border right now, which is historically very large flow of unauthorized immigrants, many of whom are coming for humanitarian reasons, then you're not addressing the issue in a way that a lot of people who are very focused on this understand. But I do want to ask you, Stuart, is this idea that there are thousands of people coming in an unregulated flow? We hear a lot about the negatives of that. Are there also some positive impacts, particularly on regional and local economies?
Well, I think what people would like to see the most is a more regulated more legal pathways. And when you've seen a lot of the people who've come in have come in through humanitarian parole programs, and you also see people applying for asylum, and applying for asylum is legal. And so I think having more of those paths would reduce some of what people perceive as a more chaotic situation. But you do see it economically, that regardless of person's immigration status, if they're a worker, they're going to have a very similar economic impact in terms of helping consumers and others. And in fact, Michael Clemens and others have looked at the idea that has been promoted during Donald Trump's new election campaign, where he has talked about trying to deport all 11 million of the undocumented population. And Michael Clemens has pointed out that you would end up with maybe 250,000, 260,000 fewer jobs for US workers because of the strong connection between immigrants and labor force, the investment that entrepreneurs and business owners would make to maintain the capital and the investment overall in the economy, and the undocumented population. So if you were tried, and plus what we talked about earlier, what Madeline Zavodny's found out, that if you're going to take 8 or 9 million people out of the labor force, in addition to the social impact, because of so many mixed status families, you're going to end up with some significant negative economic impacts.
I'm going to switch from Stuart now and focus my questions with Pia. Pia, can you talk about the sectors that rely on the immigrant workforce? Which ones have been most affected by the kind of labor shortages that Stuart has been talking about?
Sure. I think Jenny and Stuart mentioned several of these sectors. I mean, in terms of industries, immigrants are really important, both on the kind of low to mid-skill end and the very high skill end. So leisure and hospitality, which would be hotels and restaurants, for example, agriculture, of course, construction, food manufacturing. Those are some of the industries that depend very, very heavily on immigrants. Occupations, think of occupations, farm workers, the great majority are immigrants. Construction workers, especially certain types of construction workers, like the ones that hang drywall and so forth. Janitors, landscapers, but then on the high skill end, physicians and even economists, software engineers, computer scientists. These are all just occupations and industries that depend very heavily on immigrants. And I think that's reflected in policy. I mean, we have visa programs that, try to, bring in immigrants in these industries. Everyone's cognizant of the demand and the need for this type of workers, but it never seems to be enough. And in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic recession, we had this big boom in demand, and the labor shortages were severe. Many more vacant jobs than unemployed workers looking, to fill those jobs. And so we've even looked at the wage pressures in immigrant intensive occupations and industries in the last 2 years, and we saw significantly higher wage growth in immigrant intensive industries and occupations as a result, which we think is consistent with labor shortages. And what's interesting, we even look at native workers that are in immigrant intensive industries and occupations, and we saw that they also had, significantly higher wage growth than other natives in other industries. So So I think there's compelling evidence that we're experiencing labor shortages. But of course, now, as Stuart mentioned, there's also compelling evidence that a lot of immigrants are coming into the country.
And also, Pia, let me follow up a little bit on that. Immigrants don't just affect the people they work for and as consumers, but they also contribute to the tax base. And can you speak just briefly about that, the taxes that immigrants pay, and address the question of whether or not even people who are undocumented in the United States those who are working may in fact be paying taxes?
Yeah, no, great question. So it's interesting. Immigrants, even low income and high income, low and high skill, contribute, on net positively to the federal government. If you take taxes and subtract services, they're net contributors. Immigrants at the federal level. Where we get, and of course, high skilled immigrants are just hugely positive in terms of tax revenue for the country. And so we've always argued if you can have more low skill immigration if you bring in more high skill immigrants, because there's such a huge net boon to the fiscal balance. At the state and local level, it's a little trickier. Just immigrant families, like if you look at the immigrant families that are more in the low income, low skill side of the distribution, they obviously typically only because they have larger families, they consume more education services like K through 12 education. So it's more about paying for schools. And, that's very expensive. One kid in K through 12, I think it costs local government, maybe depending on where you live, $10,000 to $15,000 a year. Anyway, so we do see that at the local level, low income immigrant families can be a net burden on the local economy because of the expense of primarily of education. But of course, the way I want people to think about this is that, goodness gracious, over the long term, education will pay you back, pay society back, and pay the individual back many, many, many times over. So it's more like a short run cash crunch kind of thing where we have to figure out how to pay for it. It'll pay off in terms of return to investment over time. The other thing I want to mention is, well, as you asked, there's a misconception that that undocumented immigrants, for example, don't pay taxes. And so a couple of reasons, why that's not right. First of all, most undocumented immigrants, what we know from surveys and other data, most of them work on the books, despite the fact that they may not have their own valid Social Security number. So there's a number of ways you can get around that. And then, so they're paying income tax, Social Security tax. And then, like everyone else, if you just live in a community, in a state, you're paying, property tax. Even if you're renting, you're paying property tax. You're paying, taxes on things that you consume, goods and services, number of other fees and taxes. So we're all contributing taxes, and even for the ones that are not working, let's say on the books, there's still taxes coming from those families. Perhaps not enough to cover if it's a family with children, again, for education costs, but that would be really the only caveat.
I'm going to talk a bit about a personal experience I had when I was living in Virginia back in the early aughts. I had my house painted and had a gentleman from West Virginia, native-born American, come and paint my house. Fast forward a few years, and I had moved into a new house and needed my house painted again. So I called the same painter, as we often do. And he came out and he gave me a bid. And so I sort of expected that when it came time to do the job, he would be the one showing up. But lo and behold, he was not. He had gone from being a house painter to being a painting contractor. And why was that? Because he had been able to hire, and in this case, it was mostly immigrant workers, to come in and do that job. This is not just an anecdote, is it, Pia? This is something that we see, that it's not just that immigrants are employees, they also are sometimes employers. And talk a little bit about that contribution.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So there's very compelling evidence that goes way back that shows if you compare self-employment or entrepreneurship between immigrants and U.S. born workers, you see that actually immigrants are far more likely to start a business. And so that kind of has held true over time, and it holds true throughout the business cycle. So of course, a lot of the immigrant firms may be a little bit smaller to start out with. They have, it's harder for them to access credit. They have other obstacles to overcome. Sometimes it's language, figuring out the bureaucracy and the paperwork and so forth. But nonetheless, despite these barriers, immigrants are significantly more likely to start businesses and do so to a greater extent than natives. And so that's kind of some of the dynamism that comes with immigration. That's very exciting and good for the economy, especially when these firms can grow. And they hire because they'll typically start small, but then if they can hire other people, then you get those spillover effects and you get that dynamism and the economic growth that comes from that. And then, like Stuart was mentioning, they go to the bank, they take a loan, and now they're investing. And as they invest, that's another way that the community grows, and it's very important.
I think, Pia, that the stats on the number of businesses, Main Street businesses that immigrants actually operate is really astonishing. We mentioned already immigrants make up less than 14% of the population. They make up 28% of the owners of Main Street businesses, the kinds of things we interact with on Main Street on a daily basis, the convenience stores, the gas stations, the local cleaners, all of those things. So I think you're absolutely right on that. And again, I think it's something that we underestimate when we talk about immigrants. Anything more you might want to add?
Well, actually, yeah, you must be reading my mind, because on this topic, there's another way in which, so the business dynamism and the entrepreneurship is so important, but also is the innovation. So if we turn to like looking more at the high skilled end of immigration, the fact that we bring in, I mentioned earlier, computer scientists, computer engineers, and so many STEM workers, scientists that are doing research and so forth. I just want to mention, in terms of the impact on economic growth, productivity growth in particular, innovation is so important. So we also have studies that show that these high skilled immigrants are more likely to file patents, which means they're more active in innovation, coming up with new discoveries, whether it's in medicine or technology, other things. And then, this is another really important reason, for productivity growth in the US. It's something that's helped make us the world leader in high tech, in other fields, in medical science. So that's another contribution that is just absolutely critical.
Stephanie, I want to turn to you because you are with the Retail Federation. And so I want to talk a little bit about growth, and Pia sort of led very nicely into that. So the US economy last year grew at an annualized rate of 2.5%, and forecast this year predicts sort of a similar growth. So the economy is growing. The fact that the economy is growing, does that make us need to worry less about labor shortages? And maybe you can talk about that for a moment.
That's a great question. I mean, it does not mean we should worry less unless you don't care about whether it continues to grow. I mean, it's pretty simple. I worry a little bit, to be completely honest, that we have reached the point of unemployment that is so low and so few workers that we are going to either have a real bump in the wage price spiral. And this is, speaking from the perspective of retailers, where retail wages rose over 14% since the beginning of COVID, which is really great news, honestly, in many, many ways, but is going to have an impact and has already. If you add in supply chain costs and all kinds of other back end costs, have had an impact in rising prices. And the fact that inflation looks the way it does, it's coming down. We've had a pretty good rebound, but the Fed rate remains where it is, in large part because we are probably have plateaued by some measures in terms of inflation coming down and wages going up. But eventually it will also just have an impact on output. There will not be workers in the supply chain in particular. There will not be workers in the food industry, in agriculture, in order to maintain the output and the GDP growth that we currently have. Japan is actually a great example of a country that really kind of hit a wall at a time when very few people predicted it. You remember all of the stories in the 80s in particular and in the 90s about how Japan was this incredible success story with manufacturing and consumer goods, and they have no population growth, in largely more because of geography than because of immigration policy. They don't have a lot of immigration coming in, so that's a real cautionary tale for us. We run a Council of International Retail Associations that gets together and meets in New York City every January and generally meets in Europe at some other point during the year. And it really struck me a couple of years ago when we were all, I think it was the first time we were back meeting after COVID, and we were all meeting, and the head of each national retail association stood up. We went around the room to talk about the biggest challenges, and people talked about e-commerce, transitioning to omni-channel, of course, recovering from COVID. And the head of the Japanese Retail Association stood up and said, population and workers, we're not growing. And it's a really big problem. So we have to be focused on tomorrow, because if we're not, it won't just take care of itself.
Let me follow up on that, Stephanie, because the demographic challenge is real. And, for many, many years in this country, there was a tremendous drumbeat that we had out of control population growth. And the real issue was to control the size of our population. And with some of the immigration restriction groups actually wanting to lower the absolute size of the population. It wasn't just about slowing growth. It was actually either about stabilizing or even lowering the size of the US population. Now, what you rightly suggest is that this is a problem, and particularly a problem in industrialized countries.
Yep.
Labor, the birth rates have fallen so dramatically that it is really a question of whether or not you're going to have enough people in the labor force to be able to take care of the entitlements that most industrialized countries offer to their citizens. So might you talk a minute about that, or if there's somebody else who wants to weigh on it as well?
Yeah. And then other people should definitely weigh in. It is a big problem. I mean, retail is maybe the third highest employer of immigrant workforce, depending on whether you include distribution centers and some of the back end supply chain with us, or whether you pull that out separately. Hospitality and restaurants are probably the biggest employer. Transportation is another huge employer. The shortage in truckers has been in large part due to the huge slowdown in immigration labor. But even though we're the third or fourth highest employer of immigrant labor, in 2023, 74% of retailers said that worker shortages were their biggest concern going forward. And it means not only that stores have a really hard time growing, even though demand is high, it also means that they might actually have to cut back. I'm sure that we all know anecdotally of stores and restaurants in our neighborhoods that have closed, and it seemed precipitous because it seemed like they were doing really good business. Every time you're there, it's busy, it's crowded, there are people there. But I know in my experience, when I ask why the store closed or why there's been announcements that the store is closing, I would say 90% of the time the reason is we can't staff it anymore. We can't find people to work. And there are a lot of lifestyle issues that come into play there. I think the gig economy has pulled people out of what we traditionally think of as full-time, 9 to 5 or traditional shift employment. Childcare demands, as Stuart said, the aging population, I think to an extent, cost savings that have come from high real estate prices, which means people are combining households and living together more, have all meant that people are not seeking traditional employment quite as often. But all roads lead back to the fact that we need more workers. And we really need to market forces being what they are. The goal of immigration reform has always been to open up legal channels for the same number of people to come in who are finding undocumented ways to come in, or ways that are unsupported by legal mechanisms such as asylum and refugee status and that kind of thing. We're facing a new challenge now, because rather than 1.2 million people coming over the borders every year, we're up to 3 million. This is what happens when you have a lot of failed states to the south of us, and a lot of market pressure. Markets are very, very strong forces. They're like tidal waves. Very, very hard to push back against them. What we need is to find rational, legal, and ways to bring workers into the country that's ultimately going to make sense for everybody.
Let me follow up with Stuart on this, because I know you've written about it in the past. And that is the question of how we can give, sort of, we can look at what's happening both at the border and just traditionally over the last few years. We experience during the last administration a decline in the number of legal immigrants that were being allowed in. We had a drastic reduction in refugees and other sources of bringing in new people. Now we're seeing essentially the spigot having opened a bit. In some ways, is this a kind of market response to the labor needs? I mean, markets, some of us who have traditionally had very conservative views on economics have believed that markets sort of settled the issue. But can you see the flow of people coming in to take jobs in our labor shortage as kind of a market response to the fact that there haven't been legal ways for them to come in? And, following up on that, if that's the case, how do we make it work better? How do we give people the right to be able to work quickly once they come into the United States?
I think that's correct. And I think it's also correct what Stephanie said, that you have both a pull factor of the market and a push factor, in which probably the biggest single mistake the Biden administration made is not from day one explaining to Americans that you had a refugee crisis in Latin America, where actually more people have left Venezuela now than have left Ukraine, or about the same number as left Ukraine after Russia's invasion. Never mind, you've had all the problems you've always have with Cuba. You have repression in Nicaragua and instability in other countries. And then they see the United States has a labor market that's welcoming people who need to fill jobs. But you're right, we do not have the legal mechanisms. There are no work visas for full year jobs. We only have temporary visas for agriculture and for seasonal labor, and the seasonal labor one is also limited. We have these humanitarian parole programs that the Biden administration has basically created or used, and that's given some legal avenues. But if we had the legal avenues, it would help. It would help in another way too that we didn't talk about, is it would increase the ability of women to work. There are many women who, because they have to care for their children or care for parents, are unable to at least fully use the education they may have received. And there's quite a bit of research. I think Pia might have even done some of that research that shows that that women who have a college education or higher end up are able to work more hours or work at all, because there are immigrants in their area.
Pia, you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, absolutely. Well, and the larger topic, of why we're having so much, we're having really going through an immigration surge at the moment, and much of that is coming, without the benefit of traditional legal pathways, or however we want to say it. But I do believe the work we've done on looking at market forces, in particular, strong U.S. labor markets and rapid U.S. wage growth, that's really been such a pull factor just over time. So we've saw that, looking at sort of more unauthorized immigration from Mexico, for example, we looked at this for the 90s and the early 2000s, that increases in wages was really one of the biggest reasons why people decided to up and come here. And of course, there's always countries with bad conditions and so forth. I mean, the Venezuelans are interesting, but initially they were going to Brazil and Colombia, and now more recently they're coming here. But there's certainly, as we've pointed out, both push factors and pull factors. But the strong labor market here has really been a pull factor this time, I think.
Let me follow up on that, and this is just thrown open to anyone who wants to answer it. One of the criticisms from the restrictionists has always been, well, if we have immigrants competing with the native born or even undocumented people competing with people who may have come earlier and may be documented, what it's going to do is it's going to lower the wages in those sectors, and it's going to affect those workers. And since many of those workers happen to be in the Black and brown community, that this has a detrimental effect on our own native born population. Does anybody want to address that? Because that's frequently thrown out there as a criticism.
I'm not. Go ahead, Stephanie.
I'll start very briefly by saying that first of all, as Pia, especially and Stuart have said, and they're the numbers people, so they should answer this more specifically. But there are many studies to show that immigrant labor actually has a positive overall impact on wages and on job growth. And I think what we need to be focused on is growing the pie rather than necessarily specific short-term adjustments to wages. Because I think the studies I've seen have shown that it is very, very specific, sector by sector and industry by industry, the effect that a certain number of immigrant workers have on specific wages of the people who they're putatively competing with. But the thing that I will point out overall is there are sectors that are always going to hire undocumented workers because of the market pressure and because of the shortages that are out there. Those are workers who I've always been concerned do actually have an effect on depressing wages and certainly on depressing job conditions and working conditions. Because if you are in an undocumented situation and you're working in a warehouse or in a meatpacking plant or something like that, you're really going to be limited in your ability to complain about working conditions and avail yourselves of the rights that a permanent legal resident, someone who's work authorized, or a U.S. citizen has in the same situation. So that's what I worry about. That's what I would really like to see people with, at the very least, employment authorizations and hopefully with green cards and a path to citizenship.
I'm going to switch now from asking my own questions to asking some of the questions that have been submitted by our webinar participants. And I'm going to throw open this one. It can be to any of you. The question was that the person said, I understand that the vast majority of farm workers in the country are immigrants and that a large percentage of them are undocumented. Isn't it an irony that these are both essential workers and undocumented? And are there any initiatives to try to correct this situation, by which I assume the question means to give more legal pathways to farm workers? Who wants to take that?
Oh, I'll take that. I was just looking at this. So the situation has actually changed. So here's actually a positive development. We have these farm worker visas called H-2A visas. And, when I started looking at this, 30 years ago, we only used, farmers barely used these visas because they were kind of difficult to use and bureaucratic and so forth. But now we've gone from issuing 30,000 a year to issuing 300,000. a year, which is great because it means that we've gone from a primarily undocumented flow of farm workers into a documented flow of farm workers. I'm not saying there's no undocumented workers in farm work. Of course, there are still, but the flow now is predominantly legal. And this is a really positive development. It means that we can do it. If policymakers put a workable visa out there and employers are following the law, we can actually achieve the goal, which is to bring in workers who benefit from this work and employers who benefit from having the employees and consumers who benefit from having, that output, that produce and crops, fruits and vegetables.
Let me just react to that by saying, gee, do you think that some of the people on the Hill might be looking at this and saying, gee, this might be a model that could be applied more broadly?
Well, they should. They should.
Let me go to the next question. Immigration has become so politically charged that it's difficult to discuss these issues. How do you recommend raising awareness in our communities about the importance of immigrant workers? I'll throw that to you, Stuart.
Oh, thanks for an easy one. I think that this is it is 100% correct that it's become much more politicized. I think that events like this are very helpful, and obviously they need to be more widespread to explain to people the benefits of increasing immigration, but also the benefits of having immigration be more rules-based and not necessarily be focused just on the enforcement end, but also looking for a way to take the positive aspects of immigration by having more legal channels through work visas and other means, rather than trying to just enforce ourselves out of problems we may see on the nightly news.
Could one of you address the impact of international students in the economy? Because I just attended my grandson's graduation from Carnegie Mellon University over the weekend before last. And it was pretty apparent from the parents in the audience that many of these students were not American born. Many of them may have been coming from overseas. And, the way it works now, most of these people have to leave. Can you talk a little bit, someone, about that? I don't know, Pia or Stephanie, I don't know that this is your bailiwick, but maybe Pia.
Sure. Yeah. So I haven't looked at we bring in a huge number of international students from all over the world every year. And it's actually very helpful to our colleges and universities because those poor students have to pay full tuition and they don't get the scholarships, that we qualify for here. So it's great for universities and colleges. And if we can retain some of those students, and we do have some visa programs that are, proactive in terms of retaining, especially some of those STEM students that are in graduate programs and keeping them here at least for a period of time. And so, that's a very, important way that we can tap into, some of the best students from around the world that are coming here to study and, can speak English, and then we can, transition them into the labor force. That's really a win-win. So that's very important. I don't think we want to keep every one of them. I don't the type of policy ideas about stapling a green card to your diploma. No, I'm not I don't buy into that. I think we have a good system where employers, the people they want to employ are probably the right ones, for us to select to give visas to allow to stay. I think that's a good selection mechanism.
If I could add to that, though.
Sure, very quickly, because we have 1 minute left.
Yes, I would submit that not even that system is working very well right now, though. There is a massive delay when employers do get certified through the I-140 process to sponsor a foreign worker, and that worker actually getting an employment authorization or, a path to LPR or green card status. There's a massive backlog. There's a millions backlog in green cards. There's a huge backlog in people waiting for refugee and asylum status, which come with the potential to get work authorization. It's really, really problematic, the kind of delays that we have in the immigration system right now. If we fixed those over and above increasing the H-1B cap or stapling H-1B to the STEM degree. Just fixing the backlog would really, really help with a lot of the shortages, especially at the high skilled level.
I want to thank all of you very much for your participation. I think this is a delightful conversation. I'll throw it back to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you for your wonderful leadership and your expertise that you bring, and for Pia, Stephanie, and Stuart for joining us in this amazing conversation. I think we could go all day. We've just scratched the surface, but I recommend that all of these folks have written and they've some great thoughts out, and so I recommend that you follow them and learn more. Thank you for joining us today. A couple of leave behinds or next steps. We will meet in person for Leading the Way, as we do annually, in November in DC. The dates are the 12th and the 13th. So please look for that invitation, save your calendar, and let us know if you'd like more information. We meet collectively with business leaders, faith leaders, national security experts, and law enforcement leaders to craft solutions together. And it's a really robust conversation. So we invite you to join us. Lastly, if you represent a business and you're here with us today and you'd like to learn more about how to support the current immigrant and refugee employees you have with integration practices, or if you're looking to advocate for some of these fixes together with other businesses across industry, you can connect with the forum. We have a corporate roundtable and integration services for employees. So you can find out more from our website. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next 3 webinars. We're in a 4-part series. Thank you to all of our speakers today. It's a pleasure to have you. Goodbye.
Thanks,
Thank
Jenny.
you.